Good evening. It's my pleasure to be able to welcome you to our Butler Seminar on Religion and Global Affairs, this year's theme of Religion, Refugees, and Migration. I'm Daniel Myers, the Director of the Center for Faith and Vocation here at Butler University, and it's my pleasure to be able to welcome you to the Schrott Center and to welcome you to a conversation that is focusing on the ethics of migration and welcome in the Americas. Tonight's conversation is, of course, very timely, given the front and center role a range of topics have had just in recent hours and days in our national discourse, including immigration reform, deferred action for early childhood arrival, or the DACA program, the concept of sanctuary, and how various communities are impacted by various decisions and policy changes that may enter our news feed or our social media pages on a daily basis. So we're very excited to be having this conversation tonight, and we're excited you're here to have it with us. First, I want to wish or offer a few notes of thanks. Thank you to the Global and Historical Studies program here at Butler University for their sponsorship, as well as to our internal partners, the Desmond Tutu Center and the Philosophy, Religion, and Classics Department. And I also wish to thank some of our external partners, the Center for Interfaith Cooperation, the Immigrant Welcome Center, and Catholic Charities, Indianapolis Refugee and Immigrant Services. All of those groups and people and organizations have helped us think this through and helped us craft these conversations, so we're grateful to them. Let me say just a word of introduction for our Butler Seminar Faculty Director, Dr. James McGrath, who will say more about tonight and our speakers this evening. Dr. McGrath is the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair of New Testament Language and Literature here at Butler University. Dr. McGrath is an interdisciplinary thinker, both in his own work as he's explored the ways that religious narratives may intersect with science fiction narratives, but also as our director of the core. He is tasked with making sure the liberal arts and the intersection of various fields within the liberal arts remain core and central to the education at Butler. And it is with that integrative and intersectional thinking that he has shared and thought with us about this seminar series for over a year now. So I want to just thank him for the intellectual and academic discussion that has led to tonight and welcome him to the stage to say more about what will be happening tonight. Dr. James McGrath.
Well, welcome everyone. It's good to see such a great turnout, even though the weather has been doing unpredictable things. But I think we'll all agree that even though it has started snowing and little balls of ice have started falling, that it's still better than it was in very recent memory. And I'm glad that it's allowed so many of you to be here. I want to offer my thanks alongside Daniel's to all of you who come so faithfully to these events, but I also want to offer a warm welcome to those who may be here for the first time, and trust that you'll have an experience this evening that will persuade you to come again and come in the future. Those of you who've been coming to this series will have noticed that Daniel's introduction of me has grown shorter each time. I will try to mirror that myself and say a little by way of introduction. Most of you will have been here for one or both of the previous events, and probably no one needs an introduction to the timeliness, the relevance, the importance of the theme that has united our series, Religion, Refugees, and Migration. And we have two very special guests this evening. Rather than have one keynote and a series of local respondents, we've brought in two keynotes for you. You're getting double billing. You're getting, I was going to say double your money's worth, but double free, as my father always used to say, is still free. But you are getting a very special double billing this evening with two really wonderful guests. I will introduce one of them and invite him up to speak, and then we'll come back to invite up the other. And so I'll start with our first speaker this evening, who is Reverend Dr. Miguel A. de la Torre, the professor of Social Ethics and Latinx Studies at Isla School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. De la Torre has been a Fulbright scholar. He's the author of a book that I've had my students in the class that runs in parallel with this public lecture series read, and which they found really engaging. They've never responded quite in that way to any other reading that I've ever assigned to them, and so highly recommend the book, which is The U.S. Immigration Crisis Toward an Ethics of Place, 2016. Even mentions a particular place in Indiana. But he's also the author of Trails of Hopes and Tears, Testimonies on Immigration, as well as numerous other books. He's previously served as the executive officer for the Society of Race, Ethnicity, and Religion, and as president of the Society of Christian Ethics. He has traveled with students from the United States to destinations like the US-Mexico border and Cuba. He has received several national book awards and is a frequent speaker at universities and national academic conferences, but also at churches and other nonprofits, exploring the intersection of religion with race, class, and gender. He's an ordained Southern Baptist minister, and so we got him a lapel mic so that he can walk around. And he holds degrees in political science, public affairs, and religion, with an MA and PhD in that latter field from Temple University. It's my pleasure to introduce and to welcome to the podium Reverend Dr. Michele de la Torre.
Buenas noches. On June 21st, 1960, I received a letter from the US government which said I had 30 days to self-deport. I was what a lot of people like to call an illegal immigrant. I was, or am, what our president likes to call someone who has a lot of problems, who brings drugs, who brings crime, who's a rapist. That's who I am, according to our president. So the question that I want to ask you tonight is, why did I come? Why am I here? Why didn't I stay in my own country? Now, for some, the reason that I came was I was looking for freedom. For others, I came to use up all your social services because you're such a generous people. The answer to both those questions are wrong. That's not why I came. The reason you have so many Latinx in this country is because of bananas. Bananas. And let me explain what I mean by that. In 1870, Americans never heard of bananas. It was first introduced to you at the World Fair in Chicago, and where they were selling like for a dime for a little slice of one in a little tin foil. And you guys went bananas over bananas, because by 1899, we were buying 16 million bushels of bananas a year. So now you had a need to bring bananas to the United States. This was difficult because this was before the time of refrigeration and before the time ships could get here faster. But by the turn of the last century, we invented this refrigeration and ships were moving faster, and the bananas became a big deal. So much so that these two Boston entrepreneurs began what is known as the United Fruit Company. Now, the United Fruit Company were made up of two partners, and I'm going to use Guatemala as just one example. One of the partners built railroads, and the deal was that he could go ahead and build railroads and move the product to the ports that would then send them to the United States. So the dictator at the time, Manuel Cabrera, gave the United Fruit Company free rein in developing these banana crops. Here's where we get the term banana republic. The idea of companies creating governments that protect the interests of those companies. So much so, if you ever go to the Pentagon, there's the statue of the raising of the flag in Iwo Jima, and in the bottom is the list of all the places where Marines died. Now, I thought I was an educated man, so I assumed that there would only be a few places, like, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, the Mexican-American War, First and Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam. But to my shock, there was Panama, Honduras, Mexico, Cuba, every country within the Caribbean basin. See, what I did not realize is that we were fighting wars in all these countries, and I bet most of us had no idea. And again, this is what it means to develop these banana republics. So, Theodore Roosevelt speaks softly but carry a big stick. And what he's meaning is that the full force of the U.S. military was at the disposal of these corporations to protect the interests of those corporations. By 1950, in Guatemala, 70% of all the land was controlled by 2.2% of the population, mostly the United Fruit Company. The vast majority of the indigenous people, 90% of that population, only controlled 10% of the land. So basically, the 1950s, they elected Jacobo Arbenez to be their president, who ran on the promise of modest land reform. Nothing radical, nothing taking the land away from the rich and giving it to the poor, just opening up land that the United Fruit Company was not using it and providing it to the people. And he said, we will pay the United Fruit Company what they said their land is worth. A fair trade. The only problem is the corporation went ahead and said the land was worth a lot less for tax purposes than what it actually was worth. So automatically, we label Arbenez a communist, and we supported a fake uprising to overthrow his government. This is the second time that the United States overthrew a democratically elected government. The first time was in Iran, and we're still living with the repercussions of that. So the government was overthrown, a CIA operation, and many of the individuals who lived there either left or they stayed. Those who stayed ended up fighting a 30-year civil war. So when we start talking about why are these Guatemalans at our border all of a sudden, it's because for 30 years our foreign policy created a civil war that forces these individuals to come to our borders, or because of bananas. During the last century, the U.S. invaded, troops, boots on the ground, 21 invasions in the last century in the countries along the Caribbean base. Covert operations by the CIA was 26 times. That means 47 times, almost once every other year, we overthrew someone else's government. So when George W. Bush starts talking about regime change, it's like, this is nothing new. We've always been doing that in this hemisphere, at least. So that doesn't answer the question why I'm here. So I need to go to Cuba, where I was born. In Cuba, unlike bananas, we export sugar, rum, and tobacco, the three necessities of life. For 30 years, we were fighting against Spain for our independence. Finally, in 1895, as we're getting close to winning, the Spanish are pretty much defeated. It looks like the war's going to be over. The United States joins the war, though no one ever invited them to do so. And when they join the war, they fight for about a month. Teddy Roosevelt goes up some hill called San Juan, and he has a good publicist that gets into the White House because of it. And basically, the war is won. Now, when the war is won, you have what is called the ceremony of the flag. That is, the flag of the colonizer comes down, and the flag of the new republic goes up. So in Santiago de Cuba, where the Spanish were boarding on their gunboats to leave Cuba, they brought down the Spanish flag. However, the Americans prohibited any Cuban who fought for their revolution and their independence to enter the city of Santiago that day. So instead of the Cuban flag going up, the U.S. flag went up. And this is important because for the first time, the United States were no longer interested in acquiring land, they were interested in acquiring economy. This is the beginning of U.S. venture into colonialism as opposed to just taking other people's land. Okay. So, 10 years after 1895, 1905, 60% of all the rural land in Cuba is owned by American and American companies. 90% of our sugar and tobacco, the main crop, is U.S. bound. So it's being grown on U.S. farms, placed on U.S. railroads, taken to U.S. ports, placed on U.S. ships, and then shipped to Baltimore mainly to be refined. All of our nickel, our major mineral, was owned by U.S. corporation. Half of our oil was U.S. owned. The other half was owned by the Dutch and the British. And this is important. We would export sugar and we would import candy. We would export tobacco and we would import cigarettes. We would export rum and we would import drunken American sailors. In other words, whenever you have this situation where you are exporting the raw material but importing finished goods, your economy becomes subservient to the other country that has and controls the raw materials. So in effect, we may have had our independence, we may have been considered a republic, but our economy was so controlled by the US that when you went to Cuba before 1958, the American dollar could be used as the currency of the island and had the same value, which meant that the Cuban economy, based on the US dollar per capita, was half of that of Mississippi, the poorest state in the nation at that time. So the vast majority of people were captured into this poverty. Let's pause on this colonial stuff for a second and turn our gaze to Mexico and go back to the 1830s for a moment, and how half of Mexico becomes part of the United States. And we realize that when Polk is running for president, Polk makes a campaign promise that if I'm elected president, I will invade Mexico. And that's exactly what he does. Within a few months after being elected, he sends troops across the border. The Mexicans sees U.S. troops crossing the border, they fight upon them, and that gives him an excuse for a declaration of war. So in effect, yes, the Mexicans shot the first shots, but in reality, we designed the circumstance so as to be able to invade without technically invading. When we did this, John Quincy Adams, who at the time was a congressman, he used to be president, he lost the election, he was a House of Representative member, he stands up and he says, and I'm pretty much quoting verbatimly, "I fear today the banners of our union will become the banners of tyranny for what we're about to do." Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in that war, when he's writing his memoirs in the 1880s, dying of throat cancer, he reflects back at the war, and in his memoirs he writes, "Just as God punishes individuals, so does God punish sovereign nations. And the Civil War was God's punishment upon us for what we did to Mexico." So there's no doubt in anyone's mind that we invaded another country and took half of their territory, which when Colin Powell says, this beautiful speech at the UN, we never invade other countries, but we ask for just enough land to bury our dead, the Mexican ambassador just laughed, because obviously we don't know our own history. But more important than taking half of Mexico land was what was in those lands. Specifically, the gold of California, the oil of Texas, the copper of New Mexico and Arizona, the silver of Nevada, and all the minerals of Colorado. This wealth in resources is what becomes the seed money for the launching of the U.S. Industrial Revolution. The economic greatness of the United States is due to stealing half of Mexico, leaving Mexico with the southern half, which has very few minerals except for oil, and no natural harbors except for Veracruz. All the other harbors were, of course, along the California coast. So, you're probably thinking, yeah, that's all ancient history. We don't do that anymore. Let's talk about NAFTA. According to the World Bank, which has never necessarily been a friend of the poor, the major cause of world poverty is the $1 billion a day industrial nations spend on subsidizing crops. This is the major cause of world poverty. From 1995 to 2004, the first 10 years of NAFTA, and I'm going to use corn as an example, the U.S. subsidized corn to a tune of $41.9 billion. And this subsidized U.S. corn is competing with Mexican corn, which gets no subsidies from the Mexican government, which meant after NAFTA, it was cheaper to buy U.S. corn than to grow your own corn. Now this is crucial because you have to remember that corn is believed to have first been domesticated in Central America. We have fossils that show that that's where corn probably began. Corn from there grew, it's the miracle crop because you could grow it in high altitude, low altitude. You could grow it in desert conditions and raining conditions. It feeds the people. Every Latin American country has a major food dish tied to corn. And within Central America, corn becomes one of the three sisters, along with beans and along with squash. So this is foundational to the people, a way of surviving that goes back for literally millenniums before any white person ever stepped foot on this part of the hemisphere. And it was destroyed by NAFTA. So now these farmers could no longer grow a crop to feed their families. Unable to do so, they go to the borderlands where they could work at a maquiladoras. Those are U.S.-owned corporations on the southern side of the border paying substandard wages to do jobs that sometimes are very hazardous because they don't have any safety protection laws or any environmental protection laws. So these jobs out here in Indiana that the factories were making factory jobs, they'd all disappear. It's not that the Mexicans in the maquiladoras are having a windfall. They may be doing the job, but they're doing it at a fraction. And rather than looking upwards as to those who are benefiting by this economic situation, we look downward and we blame the Mexicans for stealing our jobs. When in fact, they're the ones that are worst off because of this NAFTA deal. This NAFTA deal, if it's a relationship, if it's like a marriage, it's an abusive marriage for the Mexicans. Besides not being able to buy corn, in the first 10 years of NAFTA, just to give you an idea, the prices of corn dropped by 70%. At the same time, essential goods went up by 247%. So the average Mexican, even when they got that job at the maquiladora, making about $5 a day, was unable to even buy the necessities of life. Unable to, well, just to give you an example, in the first 10 years of NAFTA, 1.7 million farmers lost their farms. Now, when you talk about 1.7 million farmers, it's not just individuals, it's families that basically lived off the land, who now had no choice but to go to these maquiladoras. And while working in the maquiladoras, you look out the window and you see the wall, and beyond the wall you see a McDonald's. And you realize that the pimple-faced kid working at that McDonald's is making more in an hour than you make in a day. That is the pull of the demand for money and the push out of Mexico by not having jobs, that causes this immigration crisis that we have right now. Now, we're probably saying, well, if we knew about NAFTA, maybe we could have done something. We just didn't know that these were going to be the consequences. We knew. 1 year before NAFTA was ratified, the Government Accounting Office does a study. The Government Accounting Office studies every possible legislation to find out what the economic impact will be. And according to this study, they said that if NAFTA was ratified, we will have an explosion of immigration as people lose their farm and they come up north looking for jobs. So how do we respond? We militarize the zone in something known as Operation Gatekeeper. And Operation Gatekeeper was a Border Patrol philosophy of making the process of immigrating so difficult, so deadly, that it would deter people from crossing the border. And in fact, today, every 4 days, 5 brown bodies die in the borders. And you have to think about this for a second. Every 4 days, 5 brown bodies die. Not since the days of Jim and Jane Crow do we have public policy that requires or demands that people perish to prevent people of the same ethnicity or skin pigmentation from doing the same thing. There's the greatest human rights violation occurring in this country at this time, and yet I would probably say the vast majority of you had no idea that every 4 days, 5 brown bodies perish in our southern borders. And the most frustrating thing is that those who are the latest immigrants to this land, who wiped out the Indians, who invaded Mexico, rewrite themselves into the national narrative as the victims of this immigration crisis. Why am I here? Why do we come? Here's the punchline. So if the guy next to you is sleeping, wake him up because they don't want to miss this. When one nation builds roads into another nation for the express purpose of stealing their raw materials and their cheap labor, why should we be surprised that individuals of those countries takes those same roads following everything that has been stolen from them? The reason I am here, I am following my sugar and my rum and my tobacco. So when Americans say that they built the house, it was built by my labor and it was built through my materials. And that's part of this conversation that we simply are not engaged in. Now, I am a Christian ethicist, so I have to now talk about something Christian. The way many Christians deal with the situation reveals how colonized their minds are. Usually when we talk about immigrations and immigrants, we talk about showing hospitality. We need to practice the virtue of hospitality. Now that sounds nice. But hospitality assumes that you own the house. And out of the goodness of your heart, you're going to show it with these unfortunate individuals who are at your doorstep. We built that house, and we want our damn house back. This is not an issue of hospitality, it's an issue of restitution. What do we owe for 100 years and counting of stealing other people's raw materials and their cheap labor? What do we owe those people for all the damage that we have done? And as long as we keep talking about, they're bringing drugs and they're dangerous and this chatter, we ignore the gaslighting that it is the thieves who are calling us thieves. It is those who have stolen from us who say we are the ones that are a danger to society. And we believe that narrative. We believe it so much that we're willing to sell out the dreamers to reopen the government because it's more expedient and because they really don't count. I have worked on the border, taking students there and doing my own work there. I have seen and recorded border agents cutting up the water jugs we leave behind. Right now, I don't care what your views on immigration are, but can we at least agree to be humane and give someone dying of thirst some water? But our policy of deterrence basically requires the destruction of the essence that people need to survive, water. I have seen and recorded the testimonies of individuals who have been placed in the back of Border Patrol vehicles and driven through the desert at high speeds with the heater on. Anywhere else, we would call this torture. Stories of children who are incarcerated, separated from parents, and then sent over back to Mexico at 3 a.m. to dangerous border towns where there were no social services open and available for them. Our policies are policies that bring death to a group of people because of their skin pigmentation. This is a crisis that requires all of us to engage in. And not just to become good Christians, but good Jews and good Muslims and good Hindus and good atheists and good agnostics, and maybe just good humans. But we rather preach about personal piety than actually do our faith. Why am I here? I'd rather be in my own country. Nobody wants to leave their country. I'd rather be listening to my own music, speaking my own language, enjoying my own culture. But the foreign policies of this empire have forced me to take those roads, bringing me to the very country that caused me to leave mine in the first place. In a country that's angry at me for not being grateful enough for being here. That's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Our second keynote speaker of the evening is the Reverend John L. McCullough, who is president and CEO of Church World Service, a global humanitarian agency with programs in development, advocacy for social justice, and refugee assistance. The organization has been around for more than 70 years, and Reverend McCullough has led this organization since, I believe, 2000, if that's correct. It was formed after World War II when multiple denominations came together with the mission of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, healing the sick, comforting the aged, and sheltering the homeless. The Church World Services reports have made a direct impact on public policy, and its activities, both abroad and at home, have touched countless lives and inspired others to action in areas such as refugee resettlement, agricultural development, and disaster relief, with the largest part of its annual budget going towards services for displaced peoples. McCullough has served as a member of the White House Task Force on Global Poverty and Development, and is, in addition to all that, an ordained United Methodist minister. So he may not walk around quite as much, but otherwise there'll be a lot in common. So please join me in welcoming John McCullough to the podium.
I declined to use the lapel pin microphone, so I won't walk around at all. But it's always interesting to hear the perspectives that others bring on topics that we hold in common. And so thank you, Dr. Delatorre, for your presentation. You know, we could place the crisis of migration to the Americas on the shoulders of a single individual. But the reality is that this crisis has fully revealed the deep schism that exists in American political and social life. Donald J. Trump has served to give it a face and a personality, but to suggest that had he not been elected to the presidency, or that whenever his term in office ends, that these issues will simply dissipate is errant. Americans are deeply divided on the question, as Dr. Delatorre said, of welcome and hospitality, whether a wall should be built along the country's southern border. And there is, in all honesty, opposition to the idea of houses of worship and communities offering sanctuary. That division, while difficult to fully define, is nonetheless codified by an approximate 34% of the electorate that has consistently supported the president's executive decisions. This is equally reflected in the often difficult and delicate conversation when any of us broach these topics, and the uncomfortable uncertainty as to whether others with whom we speak agree with us. That certainly will be true of this audience. It certainly is true of the 37 different faith communities that represent the core of Church World Service. Our family of churches, mainline Protestant, Anglican, Orthodox, Peace, and historic Black churches, posit an eclectic mix of views on these topics, and for a wide range of reasons. And this demonstrates that there is no obvious panacea. This crisis of migration and welcome has exposed a wound in American religious and secular life, just as it has in our politics. Early last year, Church World Service hosted a meeting of leaders from these churches to discuss President Trump's decision to reduce refugee resettlement in the United States. This decision led to a historic reduction in the number of people to be resettled, and illegally, albeit indirectly, used faith as a criteria for eligibility. Furthermore, it consequently threatened to dismantle the very infrastructure for the resettlement and successful integration of persons seeking refuge or asylum into communities across the United States. These policies discriminate and endanger vulnerable populations and a major faith tradition under the guise of national security. Long before the United States government formalized the program during the Carter administration, these same churches supported resettlement beginning in 1946. And since then, they have assisted more than 1 million people to begin a new life in communities all across the United States. Similarly, the Trump administration has targeted immigrants generally, and especially those from Central and South America. Through a slew of policy changes, they have escalated raids, detention, and deportation of our immigrant neighbors, and have made it much more difficult for people to seek asylum. While our neighbors in the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, are facing record levels of violence, the administration has eliminated the only safe way for children fleeing gang conscription to find safety in the United States, the Central American Minors Program, or CAM, deleting approximately 6,000 pending applications of children with parents already in the United States. And the administration has already terminated temporary protected status for Hondurans, Nicaraguans, and Salvadorans, as well as Haitians and other communities, telling hundreds of thousands of individuals who have been part of the fabric of our communities for decades that they will be removed from the United States in a matter of months. Our February consultation of church leaders resulted in the formulation of what we call an ecumenical declaration, protecting, welcome, restoring hope. And this declaration voiced our strong opposition to these executive orders and policies, to stand in solidarity with more than 30 million Americans, to represent our united resolve to love our neighbor as ourselves and to act justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with our God in fellowship with the vulnerable, the outcast, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, and all persons in need. And to affirm that as Americans, we are in fact a nation of displaced persons. And while this was strongly acclaimed by the leadership, achieving grassroots or congregational ownership proved to be a more daunting challenge. While personally, and certainly as an agency, Church Will Service, we are not conflicted about the meaning of Matthew 25:35, for I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Within congregational life, people have different views as to whether they in fact recognize the face of Christ in the immigrant and the refugee. For more than 70 years, Church Will Service has proven that Americans can get along with each other and build strong, welcoming communities. Our member churches and congregations reflect the mosaic and demographics of our nation, theologically, racially, politically. And never in our history has that hospitality been withdrawn or been so hotly debated. And despite our differences, it is unimaginable that we would find ourselves in that situation today. In an essay, American Exceptionalism and America First, Abram Van Engen makes the distinction by emphasizing that in Mr. Trump's vision, there is no rise from immigration, no fleeing from the oppression in the American past, no historical movement from one land to another. There is only the present day, only sovereignty and self-interest here and now. Many conservative and evangelicals find inspiration in the American ideal and divine purpose of a city on a hill, while progressives are especially drawn to Micah's prophecy in chapter 6, verse 8, to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God, these as essential parts of American hospitality and care for others. This vision of America First is something very different. It challenges our historical notions of purpose and justice as a society. So what are we seeing today from empires and from individuals when it comes to reconciling our national identity with our understanding of what it means to exercise fair play. The world is experiencing the worst migration crisis in history, with more than 66 million people displaced, 23 million of them refugees. And at the same time, this president has rolled back decades of U.S. leadership, bringing the refugee admissions cap in the U.S. to the lowest number in our history, 45,000, as compared to an annual average of 95,000. With executive orders and policy changes meant to dismantle the U.S. refugee program, it will be a miracle if we can resettle even 20,000 refugees in the year 2018. Mothers are separated from their children, husbands from their wives. We are even defining relevant relationships, rejecting grandparents, and many other cultural norms. Those who have no other option have their last hope at safety taken away, in some cases dashed before, and for others, even as they set out to find their place of refuge. The flurry of executive orders, court challenges, and public demonstrations blurs the distinction between the issues of resettlement and border crossing by our southern neighbors. These issues are strangulated by those who feel that America need not receive certain people, as was so crudely stated by Mr. Trump about the places from which many people originate. And this is juxtaposed with those willing to defy the law and risk arrest by offering sanctuary to preserve the nation's tradition of welcome and hospitality. The sanctuary movement, that is the embodiment of action for those who have answered through their own discernment process the questions that we are discussing today. Growing from the 1980s movement to provide safety and an underground railroad to Salvadorans fleeing death squads, which was inspired by the ancient tradition of churches providing sanctuary to those fleeing oppression and injustice. The current sanctuary movement is comprised of more than 800 congregations who are offering and providing protection from deportation for our immigrant neighbors who are targeted by this administration. And this includes temporary protected status holders, asylum seekers, and deferred action for childhood arrivals recipients, more than 15,000 of whom have already seen their status expire. This is one of the most polarizing times in our nation's history. And perhaps that might feel like it's a big statement to make, given the backdrop of a civil war that tore an already fragile national fabric asunder, and racial strife that for 154 years has continued to defy it being fully sewn together, or a Great Depression that caused utter hopelessness, desperate American families, unprecedented unemployment, and unparalleled hunger. Others will recall the horror of 9/11 and the level of fright, uncertainty, distrust, and hatred toward Muslims that pierced the cloud of debris that turned the sky dark over Manhattan. But friends, today we are, in fact, a deeply divided people, and our union is being tested. It would be enormously helpful to discuss with the president the implications of the executive order essentially suspending the U.S. refugee admissions program, banning individuals from Muslim-majority countries, targeting our immigrant neighbors for deportation, and denying asylum to those seeking safety. Such a conversation is a means to discern a path that addresses the security interests, which are the purview of the government, we agree, but also the humanitarian needs, that our faith calls us to respond to daily. It is only when people meet to discuss issues that together they can find tangible points of synergy. And unfortunately, Mr. Trump has not availed himself to religious perspectives other than those that serve to reinforce his views and his values. And this is antithetical to most congregational life, where the views are not nearly so homogeneous. And while the book of Exodus details the glorious triumph of a people set free from bondage and the precipice of entering a land of promise, opportunity, and hope, we do well to be reminded that Canaan would have no such meaning for those seeking refuge were it not for the atrocities that they experienced in Egypt. It is only when one feels that his or her humanity is under siege that the hunger and thirst for freedom becomes more meaningful and more urgent. Has there ever been a time when people did not sense the gathering of storm clouds, when they did not worry about their survivability or that of their neighbor? The search for promise, opportunity, and hope doesn't merely happen by accident, but because of inhumanity, systemic failure, and violence in its many forms. Christianity was born to be part of the solution. Who among us has not felt the disappointment of an empty promise? Isn't opportunity determined largely by culture, personality, talent, preference, and prejudice? Is hope ever guaranteed to anyone? The risk of the Exodus is only affirmed when something better is found on the other side. In between, however, is the arduous journey, with no road map to assure that one is ever moving in the right direction, and no assurance of being met by friend or foe. Seeking refuge is hard. Most people see the complexities of what could be gained, but also of what could be lost, of what ultimately might be better, but also what might be worse. When promise, opportunity, and hope seem more of a mirage and not the central message of our faith, the relevant question becomes, is God with us or not? Inherent in this are the ethical questions about fundamental fairness of injustice, inequity, and inhumanity. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, framed the question this way. He said, "Do we want migration to be a source of prosperity and international solidarity, or a byword for inhumanity and social friction?" Throughout the Bible, welcome the stranger is the most frequent commandment that God gives God's people, telling them that they were strangers in the land of Egypt, that by welcoming the immigrant, they welcome God, that upon Judgment Day, those who turn away immigrants will be turned away themselves, and that by welcoming newcomers, many have entertained angels unawares. The question for us as people of faith is, how do we respond? Do we sit by while our government betrays the best of our values and dismantles our country's capacity and will to fulfill the commandment to welcome the stranger? Many people of faith are calling on their members of Congress to hold the administration accountable to a bare minimum meeting that refugee admissions cap of 45,000, to protect our brothers and sisters with DACA and TPS, and to welcome asylum seekers and immigrants from all parts of the world. Anything less is a deal many of us are simply unwilling to be party to. As to the ethics of welcoming or denying our global neighbors seeking refuge, the Bible is clear. God expects us to welcome. And this might not be popular amongst those who profit from detention centers, cheap labor, and fanning the flames of xenophobia and nationalism. And that makes it even more urgent that we as people of faith lift our voices, speak truth to power, and demand change and accountability from those who represent us in government, that we, in fact, protect welcome. After all, were we to be the refugee, the answer would certainly be clear. We would want our brothers and sisters to put everything on the line for us, to welcome us, and to make clear and unequivocal our opposition to policies such as walls, raids, bans, and family separation. Then why, given the wealth and privilege that we have, is it so easy for us to turn a blind eye to our neighbors in need of welcome? Why is it easy for us to point to excuses? A quote attributed to Luther puts it plainly. If I profess with the loudest voice and clearest exposition every portion of the Word of God except precisely that little point which the world and the devil are at that moment attacking, I am not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing him. Where the battle rages, there the loyalty of the soldier is proved. And to be steady on all the battle fronts besides is mere flight and disgrace if he flinches at that point. Given the plight and urgency of more than 11 million people who have found refuge in the United States from unspeakable despair and chaos, does America have a responsibility to be the place called promise, opportunity, and hope, where God's people might find welcome and respite? Scripture can indeed be used to make the case, but we also know it can be used to make the counter-argument. So this is not so much a matter of text and verse as it is about searching one's own soul, discerning the higher moral and ethical ground in which God would have us aspire, and living up to the true character and measure of one's faith. Each of us must bring to that question of hospitality and welcome the weight of our experience, tradition, relationships, intellect, religious teaching, and exposure to diversity and multiculturalism. The challenge is to make sure that we do not overcomplicate the challenge or become paralyzed toward inaction. I do want to share with you that I have a visceral reaction when witnessing walls that are designed to separate people. This is true in Israel and Palestine, and it is true in El Paso. Some years ago, I stood next to one of the 48 peace walls in Ireland that separated Protestants from Catholics. These walls create emotional and psychological scars, and they violate closely held moral and legal principles to protect vulnerable individuals from harm and families from separation. Today, Ireland is in the process of removing those walls. And the government estimates that it will take until the year 2023 to complete that effort. In an article titled "The Complex Process of Demolishing Belfast's Peace Walls," Fergus O'Sullivan wrote, "There's thus every reason to hope that over a period of decades, the divisions that the peace walls represent will become softer and more fluid. Removing the walls themselves is a step in the right direction, but to create a more integrated future, Belfast is going to need more than just a wrecking ball." The point here being that if we construct walls that separate us, it is going to take a lot more than just the removal of mortar and brick to heal us. In my house hangs a painting that holds a great deal of meaning for me. It is a depiction of a person stretching over a wall, reaching for someone on the other side. Gilbert Young titled his work, "He Ain't Heavy." For me, it is a wonderful, if not perfect, depiction of what my faith tells me is my responsibility with respect to the millions who find themselves displaced due largely to no fault of their own. It is a symbol of what I need to be about when walls, both literal and figurative, are constructed to either keep people out, keep people in, or keep people separated from each other. My faith is about either stretching to help someone scale that wall, or stretching so that someone can help me to scale that which would hold me back or prevent me from coming fully into the person I can become. And just as this can be said of me as an individual, the same can be said of our communities and of our country. The division amongst the American populace appears to stretch as far and as deep as the Grand Canyon, and the differences between conservative and liberal politics seems as compelling as the contrast of dark and light. The election results beginning in November of 2016 and the whirlwind of protest marches that have ensued is evidence enough that the gauntlet has been thrown down. The lives of refugees and the undocumented should not be reduced to a mere political or partisan issue, and no administration should prioritize a political minority but be committed to serving all of us. America is a big tent, and we can be a big-hearted and hospitable people. We do not always agree, absolutely not. But at the end of the day, many Americans believe in making our lives and those of our neighbors better, and I believe that's true of most of us. We know how to do this. We know that we must reject any policy that abandons our best values. And Desmond Tutu had influence on this university, said acts of public violence and terrorism that we are witnessing across the world today are symptomatic of a shrinking global village by people who prioritize their own interests above those of the rest of the human family. So friends, as each of us wrestles with this, one of the most polarizing times in our nation's history, let us not forget what God has already done for us and what we need to do for the benefit of each other. And let us remember the teaching of the Apostle Paul when he said, "So if there is any encouragement in Christ, any incentive of love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfishness or conceit, but in humility count others better than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his or her own interests, but also to the interests of others." Thank you.
So grateful to both of our speakers this evening for providing such different perspectives from such different lines of work and ways of engaging these issues, and yet intersecting not only in such informative ways to provide us information about things that are happening in the world that we may not have known about, or to bring to our attention and focus in our attention on things that maybe we did know about, but also to challenge us about how we'll respond. And a good opportunity to make some initial responses, of course, is a question and answer time, during which we'll have opportunity, hopefully not just for you to engage with our speakers, but also for them to engage in conversation with one another. I will be moderating our Q&A time, and I will try, to the extent that I can see through the glare of the lights, indicate the order in which we'll take questions. There are ushers with microphones who will bring you a microphone. Please do speak into the mic. So it should be pointing at your mouth. Please don't suddenly lurch it away when suddenly you realize people can hear you. That is the point. And we are aiming for the questions to be picked up by the microphone. We do record these events. Some of you go back and watch them again. Some of you share those recordings with others who couldn't make it. And so please do make sure that your questions can be heard. And I'd also ask you, as always, to keep your questions brief so that we can have the maximum time for our speakers, our special guests this evening, to address them. As much as everyone would love to hear your stories and reflections, the time this evening is really, everyone is here to hear first and foremost from our guests who are up here on the stage. And so please feel free to ask questions of either of our speakers or to both of them. And with that, I invite our speakers and the audience to begin our Q&A time. If you could all help by passing along the microphone when that needs to be done. Thank you.
I appreciate both of your presentations. They were very informative and helpful. I certainly appreciate Reverend McCullough mentioning that the scriptures have counter-narratives and wonder if those are informative. Certainly the Hebrew scriptures talks about conquest, and this is our land. And the New Testament talks about conflict among the peoples of that area. So I wonder, A, how we deal with those scriptural challenges, and B, whether it's helpful to acknowledge them, that those same sentiments on our land of fear and holding on to what we have, and that we need to acknowledge that in the conversations we have across these differences.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, there's no question about the fact that Scripture can paint a very contradictory picture. I mean, heck, if a Southern Baptist and a United Methodist can sit on the stage and offer perspectives, and I mean, you know that the views can really vary tremendously. I don't think anything is gained, first of all, but by denying that these different narratives exist. I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that they do in fact exist, and that they stir up questions inside of us. I think the critical issue is not for us to simply acknowledge that they exist, but then to say that what they posit is the challenge and the opportunity for us, in fact, to sit down with each other and discuss what our understandings or interpretations of those scriptures are. And what is it about our past that informs those understandings? Now, in any good discourse, there has to be give and take. And sometimes this is where we get stuck, because we feel like I have my view, I have my opinion, and my task in a conversation is simply to convince the other person to come over to my side. But I think instead, where we need to be in our discourse is to look for the opportunity, or create the opportunities for us to sit together to be able to have a fair hearing of each other. And then to ask ourselves, well, what do we do with this now expanded range of information, so that it can in fact move us. It may be a very incremental, it may be a very small step, but at least move us from the places where we were when we began that conversation into something new. So I think that's true of Scripture. I think that's true of our political narratives in terms of how policies play themselves out. I think it's true about our sense of fear. History is informative, and I think I learned some things today that I didn't know, and I have to take those things that I learned and figure out how to apply them to what I thought I already knew. So that's my answer. I think it's the foundation is about acknowledging that these differences do exist, in Scripture and in politics and in other dimensions of our lives, but that should not inhibit us from sitting down and having the conversation with each other and then figuring out what do we do on the basis of the additional information that now has become revealed to us.
I'm not a biblical scholar, so I'll give a very simplistic answer. I would argue we all enter Scripture through a certain verse, a certain door. For me, it happens to be John 10:10, I have come to give life and give life abundantly. So anything that does not give life abundantly is not Scripture. Jesus said, you heard it said an eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth. That's Scripture. Then he goes on and says, but that's wrong, because I tell you, turn the other cheek. So we're given permission to reject parts of Scripture that bring death. So when Paul writes, wives, obey your husbands, as a husband, I might like that, but it brings death to my wife. So I have to reject that. And I think that's part of being a mature person of faith, to wrestle with a text and realize that there's some parts in it written by individuals from a particular time and place that reveals their own biases and their own struggles. So while I love Scripture, I love my Bible, I'm a good old Southern Baptist, there's part of it that is just wrong, and I have to admit that.
Okay, see, there's someone over here. Excuse me, there's someone over here. Okay.
Hi, so I was just wondering, I read a quote once that was in Thomas Friedman's book. He says, what comes from the heart enters the heart. I guess what I'm curious about is, how do you separate yourself from religion, but also be part of, if this makes sense, to be part of it, to also influence other people? Because I'm not religious at all. I don't know anything about religion, really. And so I don't know how I can influence others in the way that you guys have with your speeches tonight. So if you could give advice at all about that, it'd be wonderful, because I would love to pass on this information, but I want to do it in the best way possible, the most empathetic way as well.
Go first.
I would say that when talking to individuals about a problem like immigration, it's important not to speak for the immigrant, but to lift up their voices. To do that, that means you all have a responsibility to know the issue, which means you have to read books and read articles and struggle and have conversation, so that when you do speak about these issues, it's less about your opinion, but the stories of those who are affected. One of the principal tenets of my own journey is radical solidarity with the oppressed. And for me, that means I can't ever speak for the oppressed. I can only share their stories. And I find that in the sharing of stories, people are more likely to hear that than any fancy argument and deep theological or theoretical concept I might be happy to share. So like in all my writings, they're mostly just stories all strung together. And I think that's the power that you all can have.
Yeah, look, all four of my grandparents were lay preachers, so I almost couldn't escape a faith context, okay? So, I sort of acknowledge that that's just my reality. That you don't doesn't make you less of a person than I am. It just means that our contexts are different. Inherent in faith is a series of values and principles, which are oftentimes identified in the word of Scripture. Not exclusively, because there are multiple layers of interpretations and, all kinds of stories and myths and whatever, but also in the context of a person that doesn't claim a faith tradition. There are also values and principles, that guide how you think and how you act and how you respond to situations. So for me, I would say the challenge is for you to be in touch with what are those values and what are those principles that are critical to who you are, and to use that as the rudder that really helps you to navigate through difficult waters and difficult issues that confront your lives and the lives of those that you love and that you care for. I happen to use a faith context. For me, it happens to be Christianity, but there are lots of different faith traditions. And one of the things that I like about Church Will Service, is that when it was created, yes, it was created by a series of churches, but it said it's not about evangelization. It decided that it was there for any and everybody who felt that their values aligned with what this particular group of churches were saying, that poverty is wrong, that hunger is wrong, that when people are displaced, they have to be cared for. And so the driving force doesn't have to be religion. That just happens to be my context, and that's the framework out of which I spoke. But yours is just as significant as mine.
Thank you for speaking tonight.
Where are you?
Right here.
Okay.
Right here. Okay, so Dr. Deltor, you've problematized the paradigm of hospitality because of its paternalistic assumptions and because it narrows responsibility to the individual level, talking about personal piety and things. I'm an individual, and while I can envision ways of extending hospitality, I don't know what restitution looks like. So I realize that there are like corporate, we bear corporate responsibility for the injustice that we have perpetrated as a sovereign nation, but as an individual, what does restitution look like?
That's a great question, because I have absolutely no idea what restitution looks like. But I could say this. Whatever restitution, first of all,
That's fine.
there's no amount of money that could ever repay the literally thousands of corpses that have died in the desert, to their families, to that nation. So when I say restitution, I realize that I am opening a can of worms that I want people to struggle with without having any answers. But I want to begin at least by saying, at the very, very least, let's give water to people who are dying of thirst. If we could begin there, I'll be happy. At the very least, let's not go ahead and deport children at 3 a.m. You see what I'm saying? So at the very least, we have, and I'm speaking of obviously corporate, and because it is a corporate issue. As an individual, the question I'm asking is, what is your responsibility in this? Because you benefit from it. I benefit from it living in the center of the empire. If I go back to the previous question, when I was also being asked, what do I say? And I said, don't speak for the, for the oppressed. The second part of that, which I should have mentioned, is speak about how you benefit and you are privileged by having me in this country. What does it mean for you to have individuals who are paid substandard wages so that they could cook your food, cut your grass, take care of your children, and do all those works that many Americans just don't want to do? So say that story as well. But this is mostly a corporate issue, but you have you have a responsibility in that corporate issue as well.
I was really struck by, Miguel, by your reference to hospitality. And I don't dare speak on behalf of anybody else other than myself. But I will simply say that as an African American, I've been looking for hospitality for a long time. As we engage in the discussion around migration, my story is not a story of migration. It just isn't. I didn't look to be part of this narrative that's going on, but I've become one because now not only have I been forced to be here, but now I've been told that, well, I should go back to that shithole country where I was yanked from. This whole conversation has turned nasty. It's turned nasty. And it challenges the humanity of all of us. It really does. In my remarks, I mentioned that this is a country of displaced people. There's no one here that hasn't been displaced. The Native Americans they're displaced. They might have been the first here, but then they were displaced. This is a land of displaced people. If there's ever a country where people should fundamentally understand what this is all about and should be able to determine the difference between what is right and what is wrong, because that's what ethics is about. It's figuring out what's right and what's wrong and standing for what's right. This is the country that should be able to do that. We're struggling to figure that out. But none of us are exempt from this discourse. Not a single one of us can now make the excuse that we're not part of this. No one of us is absolutely right, and no one of us is absolutely wrong. But all of us are wrong, and all of us are right, meaning that there are elements of both that are taking place. And we've got to take the time to figure this out. We really do. We've got to, this kind of a setting and more, we have to intentionally engage each other to figure that out, because hospitality it's a very difficult notion, because hospitality and welcome suggests that it is someone else who's giving something to someone else. When we can make the argument that inherently, really, this belongs to all of us. It's not about one who has power over the other. It's about all of us together.
And I hear what you're saying, because quite frankly, I like the idea of hospitality, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. I mean, like yourself, the times I've experienced hospitality in this country was mostly as though I was a favorite pet, mm-hmm. as opposed to a human being. And I guess what I'm rejecting is not the idea of hospitality, but rather how hospitality is used to maintain the power among those who think this is their house, and somehow is accepting us out of the goodness of their hearts, when it was that same goodness of their heart that forced me to be a refugee in the first place. So that's the struggle that I have. But I hear what you're saying, and I do, I love hospitality. It's just being done in a way that takes away my humanity.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. There's a hand here in the middle. If someone could bring a microphone. They'll bring you a microphone, I think. We have one up at the top first, so, but if you could send a microphone across in the meantime. So, but we've got one up there. Sorry for not looking upward when I should have.
It's okay, sir. It's okay. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for coming, and I appreciate you in the conversation. What I would like to say is that we call this hospitality, but I really don't believe that it is. And I don't like what I see concerning the hate and the oppression that takes place among anyone. And if we're going to speak about Christianity, that's not what it's about. And as a seasoned individuals of clergy, for someone such as me, who is just now entering ministry, I welcome individuals that don't look like me. I don't want to be around someone who looks like me all the time. I can't learn anything. What advice do you have for someone as me in engaging conversations such as this and helping our immigrant neighbors?
I think that, you know, the best advice that I can give to you is, I mean, as someone who is entering into formalized ministry, because I'm sure you've been engaged in ministry for quite some time, I would say is don't let the institutional church define your ministry. That's what I would say. Don't let it define your ministry. Churches, denominations, in the Protestant tradition, denominations have a way of deciding what congregations ought to look like based on location. And oftentimes assigns pastors in order to meet those expectations. I would say whatever the structure is that you are part of or becoming part of, I would say right from the very beginning that you need, it's your call, it's your calling. You need to be in charge of your calling, and you need to be able to speak truth, your truth, to the powers and principalities in terms of how you see yourself engaging in this work. That's what I would say. So certainly moving or desiring to have a more multicultural, multiracial, multi-generational, whatever that multi is, you define that. Don't let others define it for you.
I'm not going to really give any advice because the only church I have a pastor that got rid of me after a few months, so I'm the wrong person to ask advice about pastoring a church. I'm just being honest. I don't understand why. I thought that something was pretty good.
You mentioned, I believe, the term. It is. You mentioned, I believe, sanctuary churches.
Yes.
Is there a way that the assembled multitude here can get a list or find out where they are? Because I suspect that many of us have some money that we would be glad to donate to help the process if we knew where they were.
If I could be so bold as to speak on behalf of my own agency, there is a website that we call greateras1.org, and there you greater as one, just the number 1.org, and there you can get information about the sanctuary movement that is unfolding. Again, there are some 800 congregations. We're very much part and parcel as Church Will Service in helping to organize that. We're not exclusive to that, but very, very much a part of that effort. So,
Just for a historical point, the sanctuary movement begins during the 1980s at a church in Tucson, Arizona, Southside Presbyterian Church. And they continue to be a sanctuary church even to this day. I'm sure they also have an informal network of churches throughout the nation. That's another place to look at. The Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona. They're the ones that basically wrote the book on how to do sanctuary church.
Okay, let's see, I see one here, and then there's one there, and then get back down here. So go ahead, next.
Thank you both very much. My question is, in the first speech, you talked about how we tend to look down and blame, say, the victim rather than looking up. And I was hoping that maybe you were so articulate that you could just talk briefly about who it is that is profiting, because it's not the person who's leaving their land and coming to work in the factory on the border, and it's certainly not the person who's losing their job here. And so who is it that is benefiting, and why is it that in America we seem to be so averse to really facing that? And I think you also mentioned it a bit in the second speech, because you did mention detention centers, those who profit from detention centers and fanning the flames of Islamophobia, and there was one more. So if you would like to just briefly address that, we need a whole nother lecture, but I'd love to hear your responses to that.
Yeah. Since the early 1980s, we had a major shift in this country economically. Until from the end of the Second World War, pretty much the 1980s, all the economic classes would rise at about the same level in income. So lower class, upper class, they had about proportionally equal increases in wealth. But since the 1980s, thanks primarily to Reaganomics, we have begun a radical shift in where, as you know, the 1% control over 50-60% of all the wealth of this nation, when back in the 1980s, it was closer to 30%. So as people are losing their jobs, as people cannot make ends meet, literally, when before, if we could just forget about sexism for a moment, the husband worked and it supported the whole family. Okay, now you have both people working, probably 2 jobs each, and that's not enough to support the family. So the value of the dollar that an individual is making is nowhere close to being the same. Someone has to be blamed for all this. Now, we could look at who's making over, on average, $10 million a year in income, or we could just go ahead and blame those damn Mexicans who are taking my job away by crossing the border. The latter is easier. So our gaze goes downward rather than upward. And part of the reason is because we all dream of being part of that 1%. So we don't blame what we hope to one day become. When social mobility in this country no longer exists except downward mobility. So we kind of, have bought into this way of seeing that justifies our hatred for those below us, because it helps answer the question why I'm not getting ahead. Because if I can't blame them, and it's not the fault of those who are gouging my wages, then the fault is mine for not working hard enough. Thank you, Calvin. So we're kind of stuck there. So that's what I think I mean by we dream upward, but we blame downward. And this is something that the chair of my own dissertation, John Raines, has taught me on issues of economics and how that works with ethics.
Yeah, there isn't much more that I would add to that, except to remind us that one of the economic levers in this country right now is about privatizing virtually everything. And that factors in here, that our capitalist philosophy provides space for people to see, even in the midst of an atrocity, a money-making opportunity. When there are elements of government that says that it believes that government should be small, that opens the door for new industries to emerge that provide for those same services. So therefore, the government, while it is getting out of the prison business, it's enabling private enterprise to get into it at a much bigger scale than it ever was before. So those are the types of economic opportunities that are emerging. There are people who are taking advantage of this crisis in order to increase their own personal wealth. And law is enabling that to happen.
Thank you. There's someone up there.
Firstly, thank you, gentlemen, for coming tonight. I greatly appreciate your insight on these things. As a student of political science and international relations, as you can probably imagine, we get a lot of heated discussion on these topics on an almost daily basis. And you mentioned earlier how nasty these things can become. I'm curious as to both of your perspectives on how we might be able to maybe make these discussions a little bit more congenial, yes. Civil.
Well, the first thing I would say is don't take it personally. I mean, when I don't know you, when I engage you, you have a point of view, and I don't have to encounter you as a threat. Now, there may be some things that emerge in our conversation, that I feel are threatening, but it doesn't mean that because I feel threatened by something that you say necessarily translates into my sense of diminished humanity, about who you are. So I think, I just think that we get ourselves we become so polarized, that we almost automatically make conclusions about others, and that becomes a blocking force for our even getting into the conversation. American society has changed. There used to be a time when in neighborhoods we actually knew our neighbors. You're too young. You probably don't remember those such times, but there were times when we actually knew our neighbors. We actually spent time in each other's homes. We broke bread with each other, and we discussed difficult things. We supported each other. I mean, that time exists. A lot of folks in this audience remember those times. American society has changed. Now most of us are so busy we don't know. I mean, in my neighborhood, I actually had to have a meeting with my neighbors because I was gone so much, and in New Jersey, oftentimes, we'd have car service. This was before Uber and all of that. So I'd always have these long limousines that would pull up in front of my door, and I'd dash in the car, and I would be gone, or they'd bring me back in the middle of the night. I had to have a meeting with my neighbors to convince them that I wasn't a member of the CIA. I had to, and I didn't really know them, and honestly, I don't know many of them now. So I think we have to. There are some real hurdles that we have to overcome. And part of it is an acknowledgement that American society has changed and we've become so busy, we don't really know each other the way that we should. And therefore, we don't avail ourselves of the opportunities to engage with each other. Even the church doesn't provide as much of that opportunity. There was a time in which our churches were full, our houses of worship were full. Our houses of worship are no longer full. So what was one mechanism that enabled discourse to happen, largely doesn't exist for, frankly, the majority of people in the country now. And so I think that's part of the real struggle that we have right now is we've got to find some mechanisms that get us into the room with each other, sitting down at a common table, being able to have conversation with each other in order to work through some of these problems.
So let me be both honest and blunt for a moment. I hope I was tonight gentle, informative, scholarly in my presentation. And yet I'll bet you dollars to donuts, a few people are going to walk away saying, boy, he's such an angry Latino. Why does he hate America so much? Because if I could be described as an angry Latino, then I could be dismissed, and everything I said could be dismissed. So there is a value within this culture to always portray me as uncivil and as angry, so that I could, what I say, could be dismissed. And this causes within me a great deal of cognitive dissonance. Because while the empire has its foot on my throat, it is asking me, now you have to be very polite in telling me your grievances. So how do I say, yes, sir, would you mind, sir, please be moving your foot because it is hurting my throat at this particular moment. So do you see, I struggle with this. The discourse is really toxic. And part of that toxicity, is to ensure that I and my voice, and when I say my voice, I'm talking about the voice of the oppressed in this issue, are not really heard. Maybe I should be angry. I don't know. Because it hasn't been working thus far.
I see one in the middle there, in the back row. There's one here in the front. So, good. And then we'll get you next.
Thank you both. I've really, really learned a lot this evening, and it's been very enlightening. Could you explain to me, and I mean no disrespect to anyone here, how evangelical Christians can continue to support Donald Trump when so much of what he says and does is so antithetical to Christian values?
I'll just be very quick. In a shameless act of self-promotion, Google "The Death of Christianity" by De La Torre. 700 words, why evangelicalism needs to get saved. It says "The Death of Christianity," which is an op-ed I wrote, which so far has gotten like 250,000 shares on Facebook and social media, which I specifically try to explain some of this.
Well, first of all, not all evangelicals, Christian conservative or Christian evangelicals, are the portrait is not exactly what you automatically deduce it to be. I oftentimes have this conversation within this eclectic mix of churches that are a part of church will service. And half of those churches say they are evangelical. And they're offended by the fact that concept has been misapplied. I'm sorry? Oh, said louder? Okay, thank you. I do that, by the way. I did preach in a lot of churches, and I was never asked to leave. But I think also it had something to do with the fact that when I was preaching, eventually my voice would drop, and people would figure, they would deduce whatever they thought I said, and they would go away saying, "That was a wonderful sermon that Reverend McCullough preached." No, I think there are a lot of evangelicals who perhaps have more moderate to progressive leanings, but yet they've been painted with a very broad brush, which is unfortunate. Now, I think I would say that there are probably extremes on both ends in terms of the evangelicals versus the progressives. And I think I would say when you're looking at sort of the extremities of both, I would say that quite often the politics is more important than the theology. So they're using their theology as a way of affirming their politics, rather than the other way around. And so to me, those are sort of extremes that I think it's important to acknowledge. But I think it's important for us to try to recapture the narrative of what does it actually mean that the terminology of evangelicals is not defined by necessarily a far-right perspective, that there are many evangelicals who feel quite differently. They may not be all the way in the progressive side of it, but they tend to be very moderate in their views on things, on a variety of topics. I don't know how else, really sort of to answer that, except to sort of to acknowledge what I sort of see and experience as a reality of the polarities, and the fact that I think that theology is oftentimes misinterpreted, and it's really more of a political agenda than the other way around, which is one of the reasons why I think that when we're oftentimes talking about our president, he's trying to figure out where he is in that, and he can't figure it out, and it's because I'm not sure that. I think he claims himself to be Episcopalian, if I'm not mistaken. Presbyterian, what is it? One of those, whatever it is. Oh, Presbyterians, because they don't claim him. So, he claims that he's a member of the Presbyterian Church USA. They don't claim him. They don't claim him, and he can't figure out where he is on that theological paradigm, because it really isn't about theology. It really isn't about his faith. It's about a subset of political views or values that plugs into a certain place, and it aligns with a certain community that hold those same beliefs. So it's I don't know if I've helped you, but that's okay.
Hi, I just want to thank you guys for coming out. I was very enlightened on refugee and migration. Dr. Miguel, I have a question for you. How would you justify saying that the loss of 4 lives every 5 days is the, quote, greatest human rights violation in America today, end quote, when the pro-life movement would argue that abortion is, having lost 887 preborn lives every day from 2015 to 2016, and since 1973, when Roe v. Wade was passed, more than 60 million preborn lives.
I love the question, because it brings in all this, some of the divides of this nation. If we assume that conception begins at birth, then I will probably agree with you. But if I agree with more scientists who say it doesn't, then I might not necessarily agree. I'm concerned, but let's stay with the pro-life argument for a moment. And let's say I'm totally wrong. One cannot be pro-life and allow every 4 days 5 lives dying in the desert. One cannot be pro-life and kick out immigrants. One cannot be pro-life and not care about our economic structures. One cannot be pro-life and continue the unbelievable racism of this country that destroys lives and kills people. So if I agree with you, then what is the pro-life movement doing for the actual dead bodies in the desert? And I'm afraid the answer is nothing right now, because that's not part of the conversation for them. No, it's never. Here's the thing. When we talk about life, and I make this very clear, and I think, quite frankly, the Pope is the only one that really has given me good, a good idea of this. To be, people say pro-life, but we have 4 issues. You have conservatives who say they're pro-life, but they're only pro-life when it comes to abortion and euthanasia. And liberals are only pro-life when it comes to war and when it comes to capital punishment. But if you truly say you're pro-life, then you must be against all 4 of those things. So you can't be. But you have to. You can't say you're pro-life and be pro-war. You can't say you're pro-life and be pro-euthanasia. You can't say you're pro-life and be, So if we're going to use the argument of pro-life, then that means both the conservatives and the liberals are wrong. You have to accept pro-life in those 4 areas to truly be pro-life. Now, after I have said that, and let me be honest, I try to be pro-life. I really do. But when my mother was dying, and she only had 8 days, a week left of life, and she was in horrible pain, even though I'm against euthanasia because I'm pro-life, I would have pulled the plug. So we need to also be careful that there were circumstances that the most merciful thing to do is to end life. And this is what makes ethics so complex, because there are no easy answers for any of those 4 situations. And once we have simplistic, easy answer, it's no longer ethical wrestling, it becomes dogma. And I think that's what I'm pushing back on.
Failed to look up before, so let me look up now. And I see a microphone moving in someone's direction. There we go. Oh, it was a microphone returning home, and so there's an opportunity for someone else to ask a question. Oh, we have somebody down here.
You were both talking about feeling welcome or not feeling welcome, hospitality, and bad examples of hospitality. I wonder if you could share stories of when people did it right.
Well, I mean, I can certainly give you a historical example of when in this country we did it right. Because that example is the very story of what is church world service. Okay, so at the conclusion of World War II, there were several families in the Midwestern part of the country, like here, who looked at the devastating impacts of that war, and who concluded. They looked and they saw that there were people hungry. There were people who were separated from their families. So they looked and they said, look, this isn't right. And they decided that they were going to do something about it. And so they started talking to their neighbors. And then they talked to their pastors. And then their congregations started talking to each other. And they created a grassroots movement. that today we call church world service. But in those days, what that movement became was determination that this country could in fact respond to the plight of people who were devastated by that war. And before long, there were a series of what were called friendship trains. There was an agreement with railroad companies to run 2 sets of trains, one across the northern tier of the country and one across the southern tier of the country. And in communities all along the way, people filled boxcars of whatever it was that they felt they could donate. If they had extra food in their cupboards, if they had extra clothing, if they talked to local farmers who had extra commodities that they could donate, and they filled boxcars with those goods. And when the trains roared from the West Coast to the East Coast and came to their community, they hooked up those boxcars. And those trains continued all the way to the east. And then when they got to the east, then those boxcars were uploaded onto what were called friendship food ships and transported across the Atlantic. And then they were downloaded, here the original language of uploading and downloading, and those boxcars were then downloaded in Italy and France, and downloaded onto friendship trains in those 2 countries. And those goods were then distributed amongst the most vulnerable. When those trains in France and Italy made the return trip, they carried refugees. Those refugees were brought to port. They then boarded the friendship food ships. They traveled on those ships back to the United States. When they cleared customs and immigration, many of them then got on the friendship trains that were traveling from the east going back to the west. And if they knew people along the way, that's where they would get off. And if they didn't, they rode until they were exhausted and they got off. So that's an example of how people can actually respond in the midst of a crisis and actually accomplish something which is profoundly good. And many people say that that actually was the inspiration for the Marshall Plan.
I find your question intriguing. When did we do hospitality right? I would say when the indigenous people brought food to these white Europeans that they found on their shores. And because of the way we responded in gratitude by genociding them, might explain why we are so afraid of other individuals coming to our shores. Maybe there might be a connection there. Just a thought.
Yeah. Well, in just a moment, I'm going to ask Daniel Myers to come back and to round things off and say a little bit about the next and final session of the series that'll be coming up in February. But before that, I'm just so impressed by the range of historical information, both troubling and disturbing, but also in moments inspiring, and the united challenge across different denominations, different experiences, different types of institutions, to even if we feel hopeless and feel like maybe there's nothing we can do that will genuinely change things, to still do something in response, to do what we can. And so please join me in thanking our 2 speakers this evening for challenging us and inspiring us in this way. Thank you.
Indeed. Allow me to be just so brief in thanking our speakers. Being part of university life, it's so wonderful that we get to be part of conversations like this one. So I just want to thank you both for your formal remarks, but also, once again, I was just so astonished by the Q&A and how rich that was. I noticed a theme of several of us asking questions about how can I translate this to others? How can I be part of these conversations? What can I do? Which I feel represents a strength of goodwill in our audience tonight, and I'm so pleased that that's part of the kind of work we get to do with this seminar. So thank you for being here, and thank you for our speakers. Just a very brief note, a couple points. We offered a strip of paper as you entered in with a brief set of questions about how you heard about the seminar. If you could take just a moment to answer those if you haven't already and drop them on your way out along with the pencil. We use that information for our own data as we were thinking about how we market the seminar. That would be very helpful to us. Two other points. Thursday of this week, we have a new view film on, the film is called Welcome to Shelbyville. It will engage several issues similar to tonight's topic. It's about a community in the Midwest that has an influx of Latino and Latina community members, as well as Senegalese Muslims who are coming in as refugees, and the way in which that community navigates those changes. That'll be Thursday at 6:30 p.m. here on campus at Eidson Duckwall, free and open to the public, and also it's a BCR if you are a student. And so we hope some of you may come out and join us for that. And then lastly, our final seminar for the series is in about a month on February 27th, and it is titled Problematically Perhaps, Hoosier Hospitality, Refugees, and Immigration. And we're so pleased to have our own discourse reflect back to us and inspire some of the problematic thinking that we can continue to do to improve our own language. But this topic will be focused on local community members, and we will have 5 panelists who all are local to Indianapolis or the Indiana region, who have their own story of movement to share, but also represent and have worked in local organizations that are working with our community members here in Indianapolis. So we will have representation from Exodus, the Immigrant Welcome Center, the Syrian Refugee Support Group of Indianapolis, the Center for Interfaith Cooperation, and local religious congregations as well. So it will be a really fascinating discussion amongst themselves and amongst us as well. So we hope you'll consider joining us. That's, again, February 27th at 7 p.m. right here at the Shrott. So thank you again to our speakers. Thank you for being here, and we hope you have a great night.